Hello everyone, this is Martin Lindvay with Environmental Management, and this is Lecture 18.
Today's lecture is about NGOs basically. I want to give a brief introduction to some of those organizations that you would often come across if you are working in Europe, Australia, or the States at one point in your life. You will come across non-governmental organizations, those organizations that are not directly driven by the government. Perhaps they're against the government, perhaps they're working with the government or helping the government, or covering those issues that the states, the governments of individual states could or do not want to cover on their own. So here first I want to give a background. I was thinking, what kind of title can I give to these few slides? It's just about understanding alternative forms of governance, or I could say a background or a connection to more the theory of what we were speaking about in the first week, environmental management. So how does articulating different interests come together with understanding ways of doing things at all? How can social science be interesting here? So why do we want to understand various groups that can be considered as stakeholders? And then we have a look at a specific, more like examples, because there are many. And here, first I just want to highlight the United Nations Environmental Program, then speak more in details about NGOs, and here I just highlight the WWF, and then speak about some of these alternative connections which I chose, the Fair Trade and the Rainforest Alliance in details, and finally speak more about the informal ways of articulating, once again, interest that is about activism and how individual people can make a difference. So overall we can say that we want to have a look at, now from more like a scientific point of view, an environmental management. So we want to see what kind of different social development needs there are, and understand what kind of human attitudes, ethics, and behaviors there are. So here we want to have a look at not only legislations, as we did, so what kind of regulations there are, but also how perhaps people want to educate or inform each others, or develop those forms of pressure that would actually make the government behave in different ways. So not only the government is going to be directing people to do certain things, as we were speaking about governance before, which was about making things or people behave in ways that we want them to do, but this is vice versa, the other way around. So people might want the whole governance system of a country behave in a different way. So again here then, it's about study and development of ways of focusing the activities of social institutions, non-governmental organizations, groups of consumers, and so on, to achieve better environmental management. So this is one of the focus as well of our scope here, that is on social issues. And finally, this would also at the same time reflect on how management can be done in more suitable ways, or what people do or how people support management of the environment in the first place. So here we can, at the same time, not only just understand social issues, but think about in details the articulation and fulfillment of these shared interests of people. So how various people perhaps are going to be part of not only local, regional or national level groupings, but also to think about how we can understand interest-based groupings of people, the way they understand the environment, the role of the environment, and so on. So national governments have often been reactive rather than forward-looking. So here, our social science point of view will help understand this side of environmental management. And once again, here, especially we want to cut through this technological determinism, which we said would be so often present in China, where the scientific knowledge or expert knowledge is so much more highly valued compared to what is considered lay or popular knowledge, which we need to highlight here. So as we can see that there were a couple of these issues which have been highlighted by, for example, anthropologists, that is about like indigenous people and understanding human environmental relationships, and anthropological input into environmental management has also be about the fields relocation, resettlement, pre-development appraisal, also conservation, environmental planning, and issues about resource uses and survival strategies very often. So just the way of life itself, how, for example, land users would choose various survival strategies and why. And one of the things here that we should think about, how people feel what is going on around them as being fair. So to what extent, for example, are farmers vulnerable to market trends? Because we see often small farms in developing countries especially have made some transition from subsistence cropping to specialist production to export crops. But this made them vulnerable at the same time, not only here to natural hazards, but issues of markets. For example, coffee production, which had a stable price before the 1990s, and at the end of this decade the prices started falling, and places such as Peru that were reliant on coffee production has seen a shift, not only spatial transformation here, migration of farmers to cities, but also a shift here to things like narcotics, cocaine, and so on, where that meant a change in society. What we can also think about as well is organic farming. To what extent do we want to eliminate the use of harmful chemicals? So to what extent at all do we want to protect the environment from degradation, which is increasingly manifest and will raise demands for a shift to organic type production. So to what extent are we looking for far-reaching effects based on reduction of environmental pollution? And this can have various benefits. Of course, we can think here about soil and carbon issues, of biodiversity, water conservation, but in general we can say that organic production will aim at marketing produce to offer the consumer reduced exposure to harmful chemicals and the sense of supporting the environmental care. So it will be, as environmental managers, important to engage with the right people in appropriate ways and so to achieve various results. So here the stakeholder analysis will be important, and we'll have to identify all these stakeholders and work through what power relations there are present, what interests they have, capacities, needs, and so on. So here we need to identify these key individuals within groups as well, and so stakeholder analysis and management will be widely used. What we want to see here very often is marginalized people who perhaps we would not identify easily. And why this is important, because some of these people would be often in conflict with the environment. So just because we don't see people doesn't mean that they don't have perhaps harmful impacts. If we have a big investor, a rich guy, loud person who wants to invest, and environmental management has to decide whether there are any concerns about environmental pollution, it will be easy to find these people or these groups or businesses. But often, like farmers will at the same time, or those poor people have effect on the environment as well, we perhaps will not find out about easily. So these people would often have no alternative and must use resources to try and survive somehow. So the official response may be to offer aid for social development and legislate against them, hound them onto somewhere else, or resettlement. But we need to understand and perhaps help them in certain ways, but in the first place understand that they can come into conflict with the environment as well. So in the past, often what we've seen that some of these indigenous people, so those who live, work in areas for decades or centuries, would often be ignored or exploited. But since the 1970s onwards, it seems that some of these groups, indigenous people, would be strengthening some control over their life and have more access to resources, or at least be heard of through the media. So many now could even hire lawyers and other advisories, and once isolated groups network with other peoples, some on the opposite side of the world perhaps. Okay, so let's see some of these groupings then that we can talk about. And the first thing I just want to highlight here is the United Nations Environmental Program, which is basically an agency of the United Nations. The United Nations, of course, is going to be comprised of countries of the planet, not all of them, and the People's Republic of China has not been part of the United Nations until the 1970s, as Taiwan took its place before and they got replaced. Anyhow, these are political issues, but what we just want to see here is that this is not truly an NGO that we're talking about, because it's especially about governmental issues. So this would be coordinating the United Nations environmental activities and assist developing countries in implementing environmentally sound practices through policies. So what it says, or how we can define what's going on here, developing international environmental conventions, promoting environmental science and information, and illustrating the way those can be implemented in conjunction with policy, and working on the development and implementation of policy with national governments, regional institutions, in conjunction with environmental non-government organizations. So once again, if we think about the United Nations Environment Program, it's not going to be an NGO itself. It's more like an umbrella that embraces governments and various NGOs perhaps as well. But very broadly, it is going to be about government and the issues that governments find interesting. So what will be NGOs? Those are going to be non-governmental organizations. So simply, whatever that is not going to be directed by the state. And often again, these are going to be often focusing on those topics, those issues, or those people that the government does not find interesting or worth or valuable or simply beneficial to take care of. So they want to achieve social or political aims often, but this is not controlled by a government. And often, again, support of marginalized groups in some ways that would be not powerful enough to become active stakeholders otherwise in supporting sustainability or the environment. So what we can think of, for example, a typical or a well-known NGO would be the Worldwide Fund for Nature, or earlier World Wildlife Fund, as it was called. And we know this logo perhaps from various advertisements also in China, which was, of course, a panda, so endangered species individual here. And this is an international non-governmental organization that was founded in 1961. What we can think of what the aim of all this is, specifically about wilderness preservation, and later on has it spread out to other issues that can be about food, climate, energy, fresh water, and so on. Although the original focus was on biodiversity. Now, why this is interesting, because in China as well it's appeared. So since the 1980s, it has been the first international conservation organization that was invited to work in China. And the work here is between Chinese government and the WWF is fruitful. It's not actually against each other how they would operate, the government and an NGO. So there was joint WWF and Ministry of Forestry panda surveys that provided some of these population numbers and distribution estimates. Also analysis of satellite imagery that confirmed the drastic changes in panda territories that also showed 50% loss of habitat between 1974 and 1989. So there were a bunch of these field studies about behavior and ecological conditions around giant panda populations. And so there was also a creation of a management plan for species done with the help of WWF, and this provided support for the establishment of the breeding center of pandas within the Wolong Nature Reserve. So, as it has been adopted by China's State Council in 1992, this plan calls for the establishment of other nature reserves, the improvement of management of the 13 existing reserves, and also construction of 17 migratory corridors that would enable interaction between various populations. So here we can say that the WWF had or has a rather fruitful cooperation with the state.